Hi everyone, it's Jerry. I have an excellent game to share with you from the ninth and final round of the round robin portion of the 2025 Freestyle Chess Grand Slam Tour. This was played on February 8th on the white end world champion Gukesh against former world champion Magnus Carlsen. Very interesting game here. I really think how the opening was played here is beautiful. Nice positional play by both sides from this start position, number 931. Time control is 10 plus 10. Now, with this initial arrangement, the A pawns and H pawns are unprotected, but neither of them really vulnerable to quick strikes. No black piece that can quickly target these pawns, and the same story here with the black pawns. Now, the only other question, is there a knight that could quickly maybe get to these 2 points? The A pawns, not really. The A pawns, all right, maybe. There's 2 moves out before there's a quick strike. Smothered mate to the queen. There would be a convenient defense with this setup. Push a pawn up, drop a knight here, there you go, things are cool. So no great vulnerable points to start. The first move of this game is f4. Very healthy. Air for the queen, knight ready to be tucked right behind. Now, what's right around the corner is the forming of a pawn duo. And this is the same story with regular chess. Try to interfere with an opponent trying to create a pawn duo. Carlsen's start is with b6. There we go. Controlling here this e4 square. Now, another note here is that these pawns right in front of the king, you want to be a little bit careful about moving these guys. Is there a diagonal opening up one way or the other? Might there be queen a6 landing a check now that b6 is in there? It wouldn't really be a great issue. In fact, you could even see some line where the queen ends up getting trapped like this if she tries to go hunting for a pawn. All right, main point, bishop is helped, a duo prevented. Other first moves, you could play in a symmetrical fashion, or if you want to squeeze a little bit more out of the b pawn, you could go 2 squares. All right, it's just a single step, not as big a commitment, no great weaknesses with the b6. b5, different story. We continue here with b3. Knight h6, unusual at first glance, but its point will soon be revealed. The queen is defending the bishop, paves the way for this early dark square bishop exchange. Now that the bishops, a pair of bishops has been exchanged here, working with just these light square bishops, in general, pawns on dark should be healthy. From here, g3, c5. This opens up a square for the knight, quickly makes use of that square, so you could forget about any check there. Knight e3, let's cut out a square here. Knight f2, paving the way for a pawn duo. And now, from here, we see knight f7. Notice, no quick commitment by either side with the kings. Staying flexible. If you make a commitment here, there would be an immediate drawback. Let's see what this looks like if Carlsen castled here. There would be queen h3. 2 unprotected points all of a sudden. All right, in this one, we have knight f7. Now, I want to pause for a moment. This is a very flexible start to the game. These last 2 moves have freed up a couple pawns. These pawns here were the last pawns that didn't have a move. Every pawn now has the option to move. We're not quite sure how the structure is going to pan out just yet. Things start to heat up, though, in the center. White plays with e4. So, very important middle game moment right around here. How exactly to react to this duo? If you don't act fast, you could end up with a space disadvantage, and one or more of your pieces could end up out of play. Now, Carlsen's reaction to this duo is f5. Now you can be sure before playing f5, or even before e4 was played, he had this idea in mind. He was prepared to meet e4 with f5, and he knew that if white tried to play e5, he'd have a good response to that invasive pawn. White's reply in this game is with queen to e2. If e5 is played, this point would immediately be challenged. It would not be able to be maintained. d6 would be the way to challenge it right away. Earliest is usually best with regard to invasive pawns like this. White is not in a position to maintain this point with d4. It would be a different story if, let's say, this pawn right here was up just a single step. d6, d4. This point would be able to be maintained. Not in this scenario, though. If you try to hang on to it, let's say queen here, you could swipe the knight. Carlsen would be able to swipe the knight and then capture here on e5. Now, it may seem a bit crazy to play in this way, giving up that light square bishop. Am I going to get hurt on this diagonal? Well, keep in mind the king hasn't made the commitment over here on this side of the board. So this is, in fact, a healthy pawn here for Carlsen. It would be. A situation like this, all of these squares are under control. If you really want to maintain the battery, who cares? Just looking at this, this is a healthy pawn plus for Carlsen. So at my point, you're not able to, as white, plant this pawn in black's house and maintain it. So he supports e4, also paves the way for castling. And from here, we see e5. If you play in a different way, if Carlsen initiates this capture on e4, what may end up happening is that this e-pawn feels some uncomfortable pressure. It's sort of on the backward side. So for instance, let's say castle's here. This is a quick way to unmask the queen, and that's a way the e-pawn can feel some pressure. So anticipating this opening up of the e-file here, Carlsen looks to remove that pawn, exchange that pawn. So things are clearly heating up now in the center. Gukesh's reply, he captures here on e5. If white first captured on f5, the response would not be to recapture on f5. If you play in that way, white would win a pawn, and black's pawns would be split in the process. So what would Carlsen play in response to this capture? He would capture here on f4, and in the end, split up white's pawns. White's up a pawn, but this will be a quick target. Could first improve a rook. Next up, knight e6, also queen f6. This point is definitely going to feel some quick pressure. It still calls it around even. Not a direction we go with all of this tension. It is f takes e5 in this one. Knight recaptures. And from here, it's knight takes knight. If pawn takes knight here, computer's pointing out rook e8 as top. And now all of a sudden, there's this idea to take the knight, hit the queen. Sort of uncomfortable here for white. Says there's many moves white could consider. Here's a couple. Ducking the knight exchange. Another one is going into a sort of pin here with the idea of a check on d6. Not a direction we go. Gukesh captures on e5. Queen now takes up an excellent central post and gets there with a pin. And it's this pin Carlsen works on from here. Gukesh castles in this position. Computer's also looking at this idea to immediately challenge that central post and then follow up with e5. All right, in this one, we see the commitment with the king. Castles it is. In comes d5. And from here, flashy move, it is a top move. Gukesh plays d4 here. So what other options are there? If we revisit this move I just touched on, knight d3, knight d3 would not be a good idea here, because the queen could move out of the way and say check, and next up, black's winning a very big pawn. So that's no good. Gukesh here plays with d4. Now, what exactly is going on here? Very sharp position. We're not quite sure how the structure is going to pan out just yet. What options are there here? Carlsen really went into the tank at this stage a good couple minutes, which is significant for this time control to be sure. He ends up capturing with the queen. Now, if you instead take with the pawn, this knight will now be able to go to d3. And notice in this scenario, there would be no queen d4 with check. And the idea would be to next follow up with e5 and have this passed pawn. Feels more like a connected passed pawn with this knight as a reliable defender, stable piece. So that would be a way forward for white in the event of pawn captures pawn. We'll see how it plays out after the move in the game, queen takes pawn. What is considered top is this very pretty queen e8 all the way back. Now, I must say, instinctually, my thought here would be you stay developed. You play, if you're going to back off with the queen, you back off to e7 to keep the pin. We're going to see the point behind queen e8 soon enough. What would white do here? This pawn, clearly coming under some heavy fire, remains in a pin. What options would white have here in response to this top move, queen e8? Well, let's first consider these pawn moves. There's 4 legal moves, but 2 of them right away are terrible. So it's really just these 2 to touch on. In the event of the capture on c5, that would be terrible for white, because this captures in here. These 2 pawns kill these 2 minors, and it's a passed pawn. That's not a good idea to capture on c5. Before I touch on e5, I want to also quickly note this other move the computer's pointing out. It regards e5 and c4. It calls them around the same evaluation-wise. c4 is pretty wild. I don't know that you're going to find many players going with c4. The point here is to meet this capture with a connected passed pawn here. That's some deep stuff if white is playing c4 like that with this d5 idea. All right. The main move really to touch on here is what would black have up his sleeve if white played e5. And here it is. Here's the point behind the queen e8 move. Black would have here a key move, knight b5. Queen supports this advance, and it hits there with a fork. There's going to be the win of a pawn or the exchange. The pawn is going to end up won after knight b5. So let's say you get out of the fork there of the major pieces. The knight swipes a very big pawn. And this knight is in an excellent position to blockade this passed pawn. So that would have been a slick move here by Carlsen to fall all the way back with an eye on meeting e5 with knight b5. Fork. Not played. Not found. Queen takes d4. Pawn takes on f5. Carlsen is up a pawn, but it is not a very healthy pawn at all. Isolated, and it will be a target now. So queen is attacked. We're a little regrouping now that we have some more clarity with the structure. Defensive f5. Pressure on the pawn. Castles now. Knight improvement. Rook improvement. And now we have this decision d4, just giving back this isolated pawn. The big idea here, this is a long-term positive. Connected passed pawn for Carlsen. We get the light square bishop exchange. Not fun to have the knight in the corner, but we got to recapture. And we have this offer of a queen exchange. That's what we see. Queen takes queen from here. Tough to really say if one should go for the queen exchange or not. I'm not really sure how to assess this one. The computer does point out keeping the queen around. Yeah, it's a tough call to keep the queens on or not. We get the queen exchange in this one. Knight improvement from here. Fork nearby. Get out of that. Keep the rooks on different color squares to duck the fork. And we get a pair of rooks off and time to improve the pieces. Healthy to avoid the knight exchange here. 4th rank versus 2nd ranked knight. And black will now have these nice active pieces. In fact, both of white's pieces are healthier, but this is a very valuable pawn. These two can't go too far. You need to be in a position to, one of them at least, one of the three, has to be in a spot to stop this passed pawn. It may bolt at any moment. So from here, knight e8. At this point in the game, quick clock update. Gukesh has under a minute, and Carlsen has about 4 minutes. So from here, rook h6, cutting out knight f6, knight d6. All right, much improved from that corner square. Healthy here on d6. Now we have knight d5, rook f7, and from here we see knight f6, check. So this is an important area right here. There is a tactic available for Gukesh, but he doesn't go for it, and I think he's correct to not go for it. What may be tempting instead of knight f6 is this idea to take on h7 and then go after the rook. The problem in winning the pawn is that this knight is way out of play. And this king is an amazing piece. It's ready to help assist this connected passed pawn. This is considered equal, even though white is up a pawn here. These connected passers are set back a ways. Still 5 moves out from promoting, only 3 for this pawn. I believe, the quick calculation there is you see this position, you recognize the knight is out of play, and the king is fantastic, the knight will be fantastic. You just don't go for it. If I'm to give you a variation here to show how this could quickly go south here for white, let's say this pawn runs, giving the knight a square. Knight could improve here, and let's say this pawn is defended, black would already be winning. Notice the knight is also helping control these knight moves here. Black would be winning in a position like this pawn ready to be won. Some other direction, should we go into this knight-specific ending? For instance, let's say king f2, king improvement. Knight gets here with check. Careful where you go now. You go here, you're running into a fork. And if you go here, check this position out. The king cut off here. There's a little wall confining the king to the 1st rank. This knight is still out of bounds. These pawns would be frozen. Any pawn move is going to drop a pawn. And what are you supposed to do here? You're going to maneuver the knight? Watch how quick this king could enter and assist in promoting this pawn. These squares could easily be controlled. D1 and D2. So it's very risky to go hunting for a pawn at this moment. Black would obtain excellent piece activity. It's knight f6 in this game. King goes back, knight d5, sort of an offer of a draw here. Very sensible, but Carlsen not repeating. He has more time. He's going for it. Throws the knight on f5, targets the rook. There's one other, I should have really touched on this one other variation, and that is after this check on f6 and the king goes back, what about taking on h7 with the knight? It's pretty much the same story. This knight ends up out of play. Knight e4 would be fantastic. Winning. And now, how are you stopping this pawn? Knight is out of play. The king. The king wouldn't be able to cross. And also, targeting this knight, you wouldn't even have to react. You could just run with a pawn, and there's no stopping that pawn. That's how fast the z pawn is, or can be. And if you go in a different direction, let's say here trying for this one, hang on, this rook gets here first, and we're ready to go next, pushing that pawn. Knight here, you just get out of the way. In the main plan, we're going to push that pawn. Also, taking out just a little bit more, going for something like this is also going to be winning for black because there's eventually going to be connected passed pawns. The knight will be enough to assist those connected passers to queen. Put the pawn on d2, knight on f2, promote. So very dangerous to play in this way. In other words, to take on h7 with the rook in this position, or to go hunting for that pawn with a knight. It's the knight check, knight d5, but we do not repeat. Knight f5, rook e6, king improvement, king improvement. So the rook had to abandon its active post over here on the h file, has to respect here this dangerous d pawn. Black is in the driver's seat here. Stronger king position. It says it's still holdable here for white, but difficult to hold. We get this undermining idea now. A weakness will now be created. Can't take. The knight will fall. What is this weakness I'm speaking of? Well, right here. This is going to be a focus. Now, this c4 pawn. You get that pawn, black will now have connected passers. All right, king improvement so that the rook can go elsewhere. From here, king to e1. There's a funny mate right around here if white tried something else. Let's say a check was flicked in here. It would be checkmate in 3. You'd be able to play knight e3 and say check back. In fact, double check. King g1, mate. And if king here, we would have check and checkmate. All right. We do not see Gukesh land a check. It is king to e1. From here, knight d6 defends the rook, pressure on the pawn. At this point, Carlsen has under a minute as well. Gukesh responds in the best way. He avoids the rook exchange. He plays knight to f4. This is a nice indirect way to defend this pawn. He's relying on tactics. Now, Carlsen's reply here is rook c7. He's defending c5 here. He's anticipating this check on d3. What's the story if knight takes on c4? This is what Gukesh had up his sleeve. He would be able to land this check here, and you would have to play back to defend the rook. And there would be this follow-up knight takes pawn with check. And this is considered an equal position, improving the king, target the pawn. All right, not a way to go. This is a nice way to indirectly defend c4. It's rook c7 here. In comes the check. King f5. In the game, knight d5 is played, and this turns out to be a blunder. Carlsen maintains a decisive advantage from there. Computer's looking at rook f2 as top, and this defends c4. And rook f2 defends knight takes c4 because there's a trick right here. Discovered check, winning the rook. Things don't change. Keep in mind, even if the rook went somewhere else first, landing a check, it's still on a dark square and vulnerable to that same knight d5 trick. What would black play if rook f2 was played? Tough to say exactly. It seems like the king would have to drift away from these pawns, which is not ideal. It seems like the king's going to have to go to g4 eventually if the rook keeps questioning the king on these files. So it could be some ring around the rosy thing where something like this happens and the king ends up on g4. Do know this is not an option because of knight to e6 with the fork. So let's say something like this happened and the king was okay being close to the edge. This is a potential issue, do know. This is enough material here to weave a mate in some cases, being on the edge. Now, it's saying a top move in this position would be knight to e6, but very difficult to play in this way with such little, with so little time on the clock. In playing in this way, you'd be prepared, in other words, to go into this pin and know that you could reliably have a rook here defending and that there's no way to take advantage of this pin. Yeah. Let me point out a potential issue here. I was not lying when I said that this could be an issue, having the king close to the edge. A situation like this, white would be winning. H3 would be a win here for white. Two options. If you take the pawn, there is rook f4 and then rook h4. The only way to stop that quick mate would be to meet this with rook f7, but you win the rook. And if you go in the other direction, it's going to be mate in 2 with g4 check and then rook h6 for mate. So risky in short for the black king to drift away like this, go near the edge. Still a lot of firepower around to weave a mate. In this game, we don't see rook f2. It is knight d5. Rook goes on the offensive now. h3, and a really beautiful move here. We see knight e4. In this position, it says you could take this pawn and still be winning, but if you play in this way, you are saying that you are okay having your king drift away from the center, and Carlsen was clearly not prepared to play in that way. By playing knight to e4, this is paving the way for what exactly? Well, after this g4 check, he can now safely stay in the center. He's working himself into a pin, but he remains central. He's giving great value to this king position. Also, do know there is a mate threat. As soon as knight e4 is played, yeah, we're ready to get to this back rank for mate. This pin on the knight is short-lived. Gukesh plays with king f1 here. Now the pawn runs. Rook e1, and after king d4, Gukesh resigns. What are you supposed to do here? Black is out of the pin, ready to run next with the pawn and have the king there to assist. Difficult to even recommend a move here. Let's say knight here. Well, there's going to be a pin and win. Make some other passing move. Here's one way to approach this position. Many good moves, but I'm drawn to this one because it pulls the king away from the pawn and also covers this check here on f4. So now you could advance with the pawn and the king, and there is no good knight check. Next up, king e2, no knight check on c3, and we're ready to promote next. White's going to have to pitch the rook for the pawn shortly, and of course, completely winning for black. All right, but in this one, we only go as far as king to d4, and Gukesh resigns. So, what did you think of this one? Feel free, as usual, to leave any feedback to this video in the comments section below. I hope you enjoyed it, and maybe took a thing or two away. That's all for now. Take care. Bye.